but taking that raw material and turning it into something that people really value. And you can imagine that same sort of transformation being unleashed on other parts of our economy, turning bread making into more specialized products, or improving the aesthetics of high efficiency lighting, or here's a truly radical idea. How about public transportation here in Southern California? Now, everything I'm throwing out there, though, involves investment dollars. And one of the large tactical errors, though I've actually sort of come around to the view that it's less a question of tactics and more a question of philosophy, that I think the Obama administration has made, is in talking about the budget deficit very early on. Early last year, the Obama administration started signaling that we're really worried about the deficit. After we're done with the $787 billion stimulus, we're really going to cool it on the spending. I think that effectively clipped the wings of the administration, and it made it very difficult to have the kind of discussion that I've been trying to have here tonight about what are we going to invest in long term to get ourselves out of this very deep hole that we're in. And it is absolutely clear that the deficit is a real problem. And if we don't get a handle on the deficit long term, we can imagine a situation where China, for example, starts demanding much higher rates of interest to refinance our debts, and that turns into higher interest rates through the economy, and that could be a real drag on economic growth, and it could hurt the job market, and we could have a problem. We have to get a handle on the deficit. But it could be that getting a handle on the deficit long term means running a bigger deficit in the short term, because we're investing in things that will make the economy grow in a way that will really benefit working people, and we'll have a healthy form of growth. And I would leave you with this image. I mean, if you go home and you ask your parents to borrow $50,000, will they say yes or no? Well, it depends. I mean, if you go home to say, I want to borrow $50,000 to buy a souped up car and enjoy it, they might say no thanks. If you say, I want to borrow $50,000 to invest in my education here at Occidental College, so I'll come out in a position to really benefit in this economy, you may say, well, that's a great investment. We're going to do that. It's the same thing as you parse the news and what I think is fear-mongering about the deficit in our current situation. You got to ask yourself, what's the plan to get this economy growing? And are we shortcutting the possibility of investing in productive growth going forward by worrying too much about immediate budget deficits? We've been chastened by this crisis, and our values have been challenged, and our weaknesses have been exposed, and the traditional promise of American middle-class life has been seriously compromised. And economic insecurity is very much with us in many households. But our core skills remain, and we're no less creative, hardworking, or resourceful than we were before, even as our inclinations have been warped by too many years of easy money and fantastical thinking and unhealthy reverence for market forces. If we can get our incentives straight, and if we can bring needed regulatory guidance to bear on our financial system and get back to generating goods and services of real value, we could conceivably emerge from this crisis stronger than ever. But it remains to be seen whether our political system is up to the task, and it still remains to be seen whether this administration is willing to expend the political capital, not to mention the real capital, that may be required to deliver the kind of transformation that seemed in the offing early on. So thank you very much for listening. Okay.
Is it yours? I don't know.
I found it here.
It's yours.
Who wants to lead off with questions?
Yeah.
Do you think that the government should tell the big banks that if it ever happens again, that they won't bail them out?
I don't think that would be credible. I mean, we can't imagine a situation where I mean, no one would take that seriously. That's not a real policy. I mean, the people who ultimately delivered the bailouts were the same people, talking about free market capitalism, and it's a ruthless system where the losers lose and the winners win, and that's where we get our creative forces. And we know that when push comes to shove, there will be bailouts. And frankly, I mean, I think only a true libertarian ideologue could have argued in the fall of 2008, let's not bail these guys out, let's let them get a taste of their own medicine. So ultimately, we got to have rules that limit the possibilities of those kinds of failures. And I mean, I think there's a lot of merit to the argument that we should have rules that say you don't get to be too big to fail. And that would be the only credible way of having some insurance that there wouldn't be bailouts. Yeah?
After the dot-com bust in the late 90s, how come this problem wasn't seen before? How come this wasn't addressed?
That's a great question. Largely because of people like Alan Greenspan. The wrong message. I mean, I think the first warning sign was the near collapse of the hedge fund, long-term capital management, in 1998, where, do you guys remember this event? Okay, no. All right, so there was this big hedge fund that was run by, a pair of certifiable geniuses, these Nobel laureate mathematicians from Stanford. And they supposedly had, this model that made it impossible for massive losses to happen because they were invested all around the world, and there could be trouble in one place, but there could never be trouble in every place. And then the Asian financial crisis happened, and in 1997, 1998, and then fear spread to Russia, and then it hit banks around the world, and all of a sudden they were losing tons of money. And they were heavily invested in derivatives as well. And so Greenspan essentially gathered a bunch of bankers at the New York Fed and said, you guys have to take care of this. You have to bail these guys out because other banks are exposed to losses if they go down, and this could become a system-wide problem. And so they had this big meeting at the New York Fed, and the bankers kicked in, I think it was $3.5 billion, and the crisis was resolved. And people at the time, like George Soros, said, well, if we don't have global rules on derivatives, we're going to have a bigger crisis than ever. And Greenspan said, no, this shows that when a crisis hits, Wall Street can be depended upon to clean up the mess. So we don't actually need rules. This is proof of the opposite. And that argument carried the day. And then after the dot-com bust, we got 9/11. And President Bush essentially said, it is your patriotic duty to go out and spend. Business requires that people spend. And Alan Greenspan dropped interest rates as the chairman of the Federal Reserve. And then money came pouring in from China because China's export boom was really picking up steam. And it would have required extraordinary resolve at that point to turn off the cheap money. And the housing bubble was just too delicious, for everybody on Wall Street. And policymakers, are not inclined to get in the way of good times. I mean, when business is happy, they're hiring, and that's good for the job market. And the people inside the financial system don't get paid to do a good job over 10 years. They get paid to do well this quarter. And I mean, back to this whole issue of incentives. I mean, nobody on Wall Street gets paid for saying no to a deal that it turns out was disastrous, and you find that out 5 years later. You get paid for finding out to say yes to the deal that's before you today. And so you will fashion whatever story is required, if the regulators will let you, to borrow, to use forms of insurance that aren't really insurance, to get the